Have not posted in a while. I just finished Against Progress by Slavoj Žižek, and I'm not going to do too much summarizing here, um, other than to say that this book is about it's Žižek tackling, I guess, what you could call civic eschatology, right? Theories of history, theories of progress, particularly teleological ideas. So everything from sort of historical materialism, like classical Marxist doctrinaire theory of history, all the way to Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, to the range of modern ideas within accelerationism, both left wing, right wing, techno accelerationist, and sort of everything in between, right? So it's basically Zizek tackling kind of that whole concept. And Overall, I mean, a very good read. It's always fun. Zizek is always provocative. He's always funny. He always makes these kind of course, he does everything with a lot of humor. So he's very good at kind of pulling you in with these kind of devastating and very kind of wickedly funny and not politically correct um, jokes and observations, which is so much of kind of his brand, right? As sort of as a public thinker, and in some sense even an entertainer. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but definitely that's kind of how he comes across, maybe even how he sells himself. But once you get into the actual, the more academic aspects, and certainly this is true. I have not read a huge amount of his work. I'm sure a lot of you might be experts, so you can comment on this or even correct me on a thing or two. Um, but certainly in this book, you notice this trend, which is where I've come to call them sort of Lacan tests, right? So when he talks about a given idea, whether it's something in civic eschatology or teleology or anything in politics, he's basically just taking that idea and then kind of stacking it up against Lacanian psychoanalysis and deconstructing how this idea and the practitioners of this given idea sort of don't the ways in which they don't measure up by the standards of Lacan, and the ways in which the internal dialectics of their own ideas are kind of poorly understood by themselves, right? And how this kind of undoes the idea, and that's really what he delivers here. And I mean, I will say, he'll get into some dense kind of theoretical bits, and then he'll break it down with kind of a pithy, witty, as what I meant to say, observation, and that kind of ties it all together. But again, with a lot of stuff with Zizek, you're always kind of left thinking, okay, how much of this is actually profound? How much of it? Because once you get into Lacan, and here you feel free to correct me if you're an expert on this, but with a lot of Lacan, it's quite obscure and it's quite dense, and it's quite kind of built up within its own jargon and its own, the complexity of its own kind of internal moving parts, that it's quite famously, Lacan has been accused of maybe not being very clear about sort of anything really. And so with Zizek, you sort of get a version of Lacan, like a reading of Lacan. And I talked about this in an earlier post I made. But you're kind of like, you're always left kind of wondering how much of it is authentic to the original, which maybe itself doesn't necessarily matter, like, because we're talking about sort of Zizek's reading of him. But without that grounding, since a lot of his ideas come off, like I said, like they come off like Lacan tests, sort of, here's a given idea, let's kind of crash it up against the edifice of Lacanian theory to see whether it holds up. But sometimes you're left kind of wanting more, because Lacanianism is very theoretical and very abstract and very abstruse, and you're not really sure, like, it's not necessarily clinically practiced, and whether any of it really has sort of clinical value and empirical value is a whole question. But then again, Zizek also does, whenever you kind of have that thought, you also are kind of pulled back into these really devastating, clever observations that he makes as well about whatever subject he's talking about, and drawn from personal experience as well. And so you realize that there is a there, but as for whether how much of it is because it's Lacanian and that theory has value, versus whether it's just clever in, a different way, maybe because of its, because it's just because of the logic of the observation itself is kind of always, left up for grabs. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a very fun read. Here, I'll show you the table of contents if you want to take a look. So some of the ideas he looks at. But yeah, this is kind of part of my kind of rambling take on Žižek, and sort of, I have kind of if you can't tell by now, kind of a conflicted take on him. But yeah, definitely fun, definitely worth reading. And yeah, so I'll leave you with some thought about toilets or something. I don't know.